The Synchromystic presents Synchromystique. Jesus as married? How about as homosexual? Beyond those, another shocker. The archetype traitor and backstabber Judas Iscariot as the beneficent liberator via crucifixion from fleshly burdens of a now spiritualized Jesus. While the Beatles' Hey Jude warbles soulfully, we will take up the latter from the recently sensationalized Gospel of Judas shortly. First, in 1958, Columbia University historian Morton Smith claimed to have discovered a thitherto unknown document of potentially momentous importance for the Christian Church. Said to have been located in Mar Saba, a Greek Orthodox monastery in the West Bank occupied Palestinian territory, the letter was supposedly written by the 2nd to 3rd century church father Clement of Alexandria. In the epistle, Clement referred to what has become known as the secret Gospel of Mark. In 1973, Smith published his analysis of the text, including his speculations that Clement's letter constituted evidence of an esoteric initiatic tradition within early Christianity. Smith's storyline went even further. He also supposed that quotations embedded in Clement's letter, allegedly from a version of Mark's gospel that was reserved for adepts, may imply that Jesus had homosexual relationships. The ensuing and predictable firestorm of controversy saw academic specialists lining up both pro and contra. Some defended Smith in whole or in part. Others denounced him as a fraud and called the mystic Markan gospel a fantasy or an outright forgery. While the secret Gospel of Mark kerfuffle was particularly incendiary, and incidentally remains largely unresolved, at least according to the canons of paleography, it has by no means been the only occasion for scholarly debate over the question of what might be termed alternative Christianities, fueled by papyrological discoveries beginning in the late 19th century in places such as the Egyptian towns of Oxyrhynchus and Nag Hammadi. Questions turn on the antiquity and relative importance of various manuscripts unearthed by archaeologists. In this video, we will survey 10 of those that, in our estimation at least, are among the most intriguing. Some of the documents we will be discussing are not gospels of the sort found in the New Testament. Many do not offer a continuous narration of deeds, teachings, passion, and resurrection of Jesus. Still, they have had the word gospel associated with them, so that is what we will stick to. Additionally, we make no claims about the authenticity of these documents. This presentation is for entertainment or informational purposes only. Number 10. The Gospel of Mary. Let us begin with a document that could have been made to order for the so-called feminist theology that has captivated progressive Catholic thinkers such as Elizabeth Schussler Fiorenza and Rosemary Radford Ruther, as well as liberal Protestants like Elizabeth Parmentier, Dorothy Serla, and Phyllis Tribble. But the seeds of this movement arguably go back to the mid-2nd century, when the Gospel of Mary may have been composed. Although the identity of the titular figure is controversial, the scholarly scales tip slightly in favor of it being Mary Magdalene. Whoever it was, the Gospel hints obliquely at the existence of an opposition to the emerging institutional and patriarchal Catholic Church. A product of Gnosticism, the Gospel of Mary rejects the idea of moral sin in favor of a cosmological diagnosis of humanity's problem. This is to say that humanity's problem is the improper mixing of the material with the spiritual. We introduced Gnostic beliefs in 10 arcane words. To get up to speed quickly, see Gnosticism Explained in 5 minutes. The main bits of enduring cultural interest in the Gospel of Mary seem to be the brief portions of the text in which Mary is depicted as a person of great importance to Jesus. For example, the character Peter declares that the Savior loved Mary Magdalene more than the rest of women. Indeed, according to this gospel, Jesus made Mary Magdalene the belt of transmission for words of the Savior that other disciples had not even heard. In other words, Mary is portrayed as the custodian of a deposit of secret doctrine. Of more specialized theological interest is the document's psychology, or its teachings about the human soul. For the Gospel of Mary, mind is distinguished not only from body, but from soul and spirit. This contrasts with traditional dualism, in which we are thought of as body-soul composites. For many dualists, words like heart, mind, soul, and spirit are used interchangeably and synonymously. In any case, from what can be gleaned from what is in fact only a fragmented and incomplete text, Jesus told Mary that through gnosis, our souls are able to escape the world of matter that is ruled over by the four elements. For more on the architect of this speculative physic, namely the philosopher Empedocles, see our previous video, Mystery Mediterranean, as well as 10 gold-making alchemists. Incidentally, supposed confrontations between Mary and Peter are also described in the Gospel of Thomas, the Pistis Sophia, and the Gospel of the Egyptians. Expanding on this, the German novel, The Fifth Gospel, published in 1993 by Philipp Fundenberg, imagines the discovery of a manuscript penned by the offspring of a supposed sexual union between Jesus and Mary Magdalene. This welter of material in turn has fueled further fictional portrayals of what might be termed revisionist Christianity. A striking example of this is that found in Dan Brown's 2003 best-selling novel, The Da Vinci Code, made into a 2006 film by the same name directed by Ron Howard, as well as Garth Davis's 2018 flick Mary Magdalene, starring Rooney Mara and her fiancé Joaquin Phoenix, who of course went on to portray the synchromystically supercharged character the Joker the following year, and The Last Temptation of Christ, originally published in 1955 and written by Cretan-born Nikos Kazantzakis. For more on the curious island of Crete and 9 of its neighbors, see again Mystery Mediterranean. Kazantzakis' controversial novel was adapted for cinema in 1988 by Martin Scorsese. The star-studded cast included Willem Dafoe as Jesus, Harvey Keitel as Judas Iscariot, David Bowie as Pontius Pilate, and Barbara Hershey as Mary Magdalene. Incidentally, Kazantzakis was involved in several other noteworthy literary projects, including a takeoff from Homer's epic The Odyssey, a translation of Dante Alighieri's Divine Comedy, which we briefly mentioned in our wide-ranging investigation Neoplatonism, and the 1946 Life and Times of Alexis Zorbas, better known in English as Zorba the Greek, also the title of a 1964 movie version featuring Sir Alan Bates and Anthony Quinn. Quinn, of course, has cropped up in several of our videos, including January 6. As an aside, Kazantzakis also translated Charles Darwin's Origin of Species and Friedrich Nietzsche's Thus Spoke Zarathustra, 2 texts which have been pivotal in the rise of scientism and postmodernism, respectively. Number 9. The Gospel of Truth. Many of these alt-gospels ride the waves of what is today frequently referred to as Gnosticism. This is an esoteric, quasi-Christian system that we have gone into in several previous videos, including 10 Arcane Words and Gnosticism Explained in 5 Minutes. The Gospel of Truth is one of the earliest surviving texts expressing this general Gnostic perspective. According to the church father and heresiologist Irenaeus, a Gospel of Truth was penned by Valentinus. Contemporary paleographers believe that the now similarly titled document unearthed at Nag Hammadi is the same volume. For more on this Gnostic majordomo and his symbolically charged name, see Be My Valentine. And for related sexualized variants, see 10 Sex Magic Cults. Dated to the mid-2nd century, between approximately 140 and 180 AD, the Gospel of Truth recasts the Gospel of Jesus, which word of course means good news, in Valentinian Gnostic terms. In fact, some scholars suppose that the work is a Gnostic sermon. Its message is that some of us, presently trapped in a fog of error, may be able to attain salvation. This is only possible through spiritual enlightenment. We must first acquire hidden knowledge, or gnosis. According to the Gospel of Truth, Jesus himself showed the path to liberation of the soul. It involves ascent from the lower spheres of matter and ignorance up to God. The basic thought, is that the illumined person exchanges an ignorant and degraded condition for a state of clarity or wakefulness. Some interpreters have detected this general Gnostic theme in such diverse movies as 1992's The Lawnmower Man, The Truman Show from 1988, The Matrix from the following year, Waking Life from 2001, and, mixed with Jewish Kabbalistic elements, Revolver from 2005. Gnostic themes are also allegorized in such novels as Philip K. Dick's Valis, which was published in 1981. Number 8. The Gospel of the Egyptians. Like the Gospel of Truth covered above, this esoteric text appears to be the product of a branch of Gnosticism. In this case, however, the form is known as Sethianism, and we first mentioned it in 10 sex magic cults. As its name implies, it is centrally concerned with a mysterious character named Seth, a character in fact that is ambiguous between the Old Testament figure mentioned in the book of Genesis and the primordial Egyptian god who so captivated Aleister Crowley's acolyte, Kenneth Grant. Like several other texts covered here, and according to Gnostic cosmological principles, the Gospel of the Egyptians articulates a complex process of spiritual emanation. This is a hypothetical mechanism whereby reality somehow flowed out of a primordial deity, like rays of light streaming from the sun. In Sethianism, probably under the influence of Platonism and developing Catholic thought, one of the highest of these emanations is conceived as a mystical triad, composed of a hidden and indescribable father, a mother goddess termed Barbello, and a divine child, identified as Seth. The Gospel of the Egyptians thus sketches a mythological history. Seth himself is portrayed as the progenitor of a supposed Gnostic race. These are human souls who can achieve gnosis, thrusting off their material shackles. However, an evil demigod, variously referred to as Saklos or Yaldabaoth, is opposed to this project of psychic liberation. So, Seth descended from the celestial spheres, and he put on the human Jesus as one would dress in a garment. He accomplished the work of salvation on behalf of his children. In Gnosticism, this work amounted to Jesus modeling for us the procedure for spiritual emancipation. The Gospel of the Egyptians is also noteworthy for its inclusion of various untranslatable nonsense words. Many scholars believe that these may express magical formulae. We hope to have much more to say about these sorts of power words in forthcoming videos, so stay tuned. Number 7. The Gospel of the Ebionites. The official doctrines about Jesus Christ, as they crystallized into Catholic Christology, developed over hundreds of years. They were hashed out especially at a series of meetings called ecumenical councils. According to this orthodoxy, which word literally denotes correct opinion, Jesus was theanthropos, the God-man. A clear expression of this doctrine, articulated in AD 451 at Chalcedon, in what is today the country of Turkey, the ultimately approved formula declared Jesus to be, essentially, 100% God and simultaneously 100% man. This view coalesced in conscious opposition to alternatives, such as that advanced by a group of early Jewish Christians called the Ebionites. Ebionism held that by nature Jesus was merely a man, but because of his faithful adherence to the Mosaic Law, Jesus was commissioned by God for a messianic mission. On this general schema, some versions of which are called adoptionism, Jesus was born a human being, but made a son of God, which empowered him for ministry. This was the perspective that was presumably reflected in the Gospel of the Ebionites. Unfortunately for paleography, the work is only known via quotations, and from hostile commentary from antagonistic church fathers such as Epiphanius. However, from his scattered remarks, we learn that the Ebionites rejected the virgin birth and believed that Jesus attained his special status at his baptism by John the Baptist. And this mention of one of the New Testament Johns, John the Baptist, brings in a curious, multifaceted current broadly known as Johannism. One strand of this divergent system, still embraced in some far corners of the globe, is a version of Gnosticism called Mandaeanism. Mandaeans sometimes referred to as Sabians by Muslims, stress salvation through knowledge of the divine origin of the soul. But their distinctive belief is that they regard John the Baptist himself as the Messiah, or at any rate, the final prophet. Legend has it that they are directly descended from some of the original disciples of St. John, who, according to their superstitions, had commanded his followers to crucify his dead body and then preserve it in a crystal sepulchre. Despite being professed disciples of St. John the Baptist, and notwithstanding the fact that they are occasionally called Christians of St. John, Mandaeans are at the same time the sworn enemies of Jesus Christ. According to the Mandaeans' Book of John, St. John mistakenly baptized the false prophet Jesus, who they hold to have been the son of the devil. This tendentious claim is given full expression in the contrarian Jewish polemical biography of Jesus called the Sefer Toledat Yeshu. In this text, Jesus of Nazareth is portrayed as a bastard impostor who turns to sorcery and leads many people into error. Besides select and previously denied passages from the Jewish Talmud, much the same idea is found in another Mandaean book, called the Book of Adam, and also known as the Ginza Rabbah. This text represents Jesus as the perverter of St. John's doctrine and the disseminator of iniquity and perfidy throughout the world. This Book of Adam is said to have been communicated to our first forefather by the angel Gabriel. Thus, the shadowy book bears some similarity to another Kabbalistic book, the grimoire titled Sefer Ratziel HaMalach, or the Book of the Angel Raziel. This link with Jewish magic isn't all that surprising, since the Mandaeans are sometimes said to claim to be true Hebrews. Incidentally, the same angel, Ratziel, also reportedly transmitted magical secrets to Noah. These are supposedly contained within the similar-sounding Sefer HaRazim, which means Book of Mysteries, or Book of Secrets. Of course, John the Baptist himself has been said to have received an esoteric initiation, though, as we have seen, there is some dispute as to whether or not he passed his occult knowledge on to Jesus. Still, it's worth mentioning that the medieval Catholic military religious order known as the Knights Templar have occasionally been connected to the cult of John the Baptist. You'll recall that according to the New Testament, John the Baptist was executed by beheading by Herod Antipas on the request of Herodias' daughter. Although unnamed in the Bible, the ancient historian Josephus names her Salome. But what happened to John the Baptist's head? Well, according to stories, the Knights Templar discovered the head, possibly in a castle in Constantinople. In some tellings, the head emanated a mysterious energy and may have been able to alchemically facilitate enlightenment. Harkening back to Mandaeanism, some reports have it that the Templars devised an initiation rite that required the new Johannite initiate to spit on the cross while renouncing Jesus and embracing John as his savior. We observe, however, that John the Baptist is only one of the figures named John that show up in the Bible and in early church history. Another of these is the Apostle John, putative protagonist of two further extra-canonical works, the Acts of John and the Apocryphon of John. The latter, sometimes called the Secret Book of John, is yet another work taking up a Gnostic point of view. The upshot of this proliferation of Johns is that it sometimes leads to ambiguity. Whether the ensuing confusion is unintentional or a deliberate attempt on the part of insiders to confound the uninitiated is not always entirely clear. As a final remark on this Johannite ritualism, Freemasons historically celebrate two feasts of saints who are both named John. The feast of John the Baptist falls on the 24th of June, and that of John the Evangelist on the 27th of December, roughly marking midsummer and midwinter. Number 6. The Gospel of Peter. But John isn't the only New Testament apostle to have supposedly left his non-canonical mark. Peter, regarded by Roman Catholics as having been the first pope, also has a missing gospel attributed to him. Originally discovered inside of a monk's coffin in Akhmim, Egypt in the 19th century, The document labeled by scholars the Gospel of Peter was bound alongside other so-called missing texts. These include an Apocalypse of Peter and the better-known Book of Enoch, otherwise titled First Enoch. The latter book may be seen in a contemplated video on the so-called Old Testament pseudepigrapha. If that would be of interest, please let me know in the comments below. In any case, the Gospel of Peter has, whether rightly or wrongly, long been associated with a strand of Gnosticism called Docetism. Docetists, or Docete, held that the divine Logos, which is another term for Christ, was not human at all, even though he seemed to be. Academics, as they do, now question the accuracy and depth of this docetic association. These days, it is commonly assumed that the Gospel of Peter was produced for apologetic or catechetical purposes, that is, for defending and encouraging the faith among the earliest communities of believers. Given this, it is noteworthy that the Gospel of Peter was among a slew of seemingly orthodox texts that were nevertheless excluded from the canonical New Testament. In the specific case of the Gospel of Peter, perhaps this rejection was rooted in the document's over-the-top embellishments of biblical miracle stories. For example, the Gospel of Peter features a stone that rolls away from Jesus' tomb on its own steam, and it has a walking, talking version of the cross that has a brief conversation with a heavenly voice. All in all, the document is apparently heavily fictionalized, which is why it may appeal to storytellers. For example, various online sources of unknown reliability allege that novelist Anne Rice of Interview with a Vampire fame partially utilized the Gospel of Peter for background material when crafting her 2005 book, Christ the Lord Out of Egypt. Number 5. The Infancy Gospel of Thomas. Speaking of Anne Rice's narrative, it was adapted into the 2016 movie The Young Messiah, featuring actor Sean Bean as the centurion Severus. The movie was a box office bomb, barely recouping 1/3 of its production costs. Our interest lies in the fact that it attempts to tell the story of Jesus' boyhood, which, apart from a few scattered vignettes, is completely neglected in the New Testament. To do this, the filmmakers had to draw upon apocryphal material such as the Infancy Gospel of Thomas. Not to be confused with the Gnostic Gospel of Thomas, which we will consider in a few minutes. The Infancy text derives its name from its authorship claim. In some manuscripts, the Gospel contains a prologue from a character termed Thomas the Israelite, likely penned sometime during the 2nd century. The qualifier infancy emphasizes the fact that the document purports to record Jesus' exploits as a child. What is so shocking about these stories is that they depict the admittedly precocious youngster as, well, something of a troublemaker. Some highlights are as follows. When he was a mere 5 years old, Jesus formed birds out of clay and then brought them to life. On another occasion, Jesus miraculously created a pool of water, which another boy promptly drained. Jesus, incensed, cursed the lad, causing him to wither up and die. A similar episode has a second boy dropping dead after he bumped into Jesus along a footpath. These goings-on prompt parents in the town to loudly complain, "He is killing our children," after which some of the parents are stricken blind. In fairness, the Infancy Gospel also shares an anecdote about Jesus raising from the dead a boy who had fallen from a roof, though according to the text, Jesus' apparent reason was so that the unfortunate lad could swear that it wasn't Jesus' fault. When it gets around to summarizing events later in his life, the text depicts Jesus more traditionally, preaching and healing people. Readers may find these depictions in the pages of the Bible. Still, heterodox, revisionist, or otherwise non-conformist scholars are inclined to see in this gospel an alternative picture of Jesus. On this view, as with a liberal position on Christianity more broadly, there were numerous opinions all competing in the marketplace of ideas. What we think of as mainline Christianity was simply the victor in an ancient game of power politics. On the other hand, more orthodox interpreters suppose that these sometimes shocking stories, if not outright fabrications, were intended to serve theological or apologetical purposes. For example, they may have called attention to Jesus' hidden divinity, or tried to bolster people's faith. In this vein, you'll recall that Christian theology identifies Jesus with the God of the Old Testament, Yahweh. People may not offend God with impunity. They frequently die for infringing His holiness. Of course, to the conservative-minded, Orthodox Christianity survived and thrived because of its genuinely divine message. Its truth has been underwritten and its transmission safeguarded by God himself. Number 4. The Proto Gospel of James. Another example of a document that has been embraced, sometimes even if cautiously, by traditionalists and contrarians alike, is the Proto-Gospel or Proto-Evangelium of James. The prefix proto comes from the Greek word protos, meaning first. Labeled as a gospel by scholarly convention rather than ancient attribution, the Proto-Gospel of James was likely written in the 2nd century. At any rate, it is believed to have succeeded the canonical Gospels of Matthew and Luke, which it seems to draw upon. The Proto-Evangelium is occasionally referred to as the Infancy Gospel of James, and like the Infancy Gospel of Thomas, which we just discussed, this apocryphal text describes numerous events prior to the life of Jesus. Highlights include Jesus' mother Mary's conception and birth, Mary's marriage to Joseph, and Jesus' miraculous birth. The document was hugely popular and widely read in the ancient world. More than 140 Greek manuscripts exist, not counting manuscripts in other languages, such as Coptic, Ethiopic, and Slavonic. The Proto-Gospel attributed to James not only influenced Christianity, but also Quranic and later Islamic understandings of the place of Mary in the Christian tradition. The storyline of the Proto-Evangelium presented Joseph as an elderly widower with surviving children. This became problematic in the Latin Church, where an emphasis was laid upon what has been termed the cult of virginity. For church fathers such as St. Jerome, both Mary and Joseph were lifelong virgins. Indeed, on the Catholic view, Jesus himself was celibate, and he serves as a model for priests today. Despite this divergence from mainline Catholicism, the text's devotion to Mary and its representation of her bolstered or expressed the notion that she remained a virgin perpetually. Perhaps because of these orthodox leanings, even liberal-minded scholars today do not seem to consider it historical. Rather, it is typically classified as pious theologizing, complete with legendary accretions. It is frequently said to be an expression of a barren couple miracle story, a seminal example of which was Sarah's bearing of Isaac to Abraham in their old age. This story is echoed by the conception of the prophet Samuel to Hannah. One of 2 wives to Elkanah, Hannah seemed unable to bear children until she prayed fervently to God. After giving birth, Hannah had Samuel dedicated at the Jewish temple. Similarly, in the Proto-Gospel of James, Mary's parents, traditionally named Joachim or Joachim and Anna, are sometimes explained as symbolically hearkening back to Samuel's family. This is punctuated by the Gospel of James, which represents Mary as being specially dedicated to the temple as a child. Some textual variants suggest that Mary's mother Anna became pregnant miraculously, as had Sarah and Hannah. Even the names Anna and Hannah are obviously and strikingly parallel. In the Proto-Evangelium, the onset of Mary's menstrual cycles prompts her ejection from the temple, due to still observed rabbinical prohibitions regarding what they term feminine uncleanness. An elderly widower named Joseph saved the day, however, and agreed to watch over Mary. This idea that Mary remained a virgin even after her marriage to Joseph, but that Joseph himself had children from a previous marriage, was championed by the 4th century Cypriot bishop Epiphanius. For more on the island of Cyprus and other mystical nodes, see Mystery Mediterranean. Neither the Epiphanian suggestion nor that previously mentioned from St. Jerome would satisfy most modern-day Protestants, however. They tend to follow the musings of the 4th century contrarian Helvidius, who professed that Mary herself bore children after Jesus. Number 3. The Gospel of Philip. The above disagreements have arisen among Catholic, Orthodox, and Protestant versions of Christianity, which largely developed along Pauline and Petrine lines. It turns out, however, that Philip, of all people, along with Thomas and Matthew, had eminence among the Gnostics. Thus we must turn to the Gospel of Philip, which title derived from the fact that Philip is the only apostle named within it. Probably composed in the 2nd or 3rd centuries, the Gospel of Philip is structurally disjointed, and from a narrative standpoint, not easily outlined. Generally, it picks up on the Platonic esoteric theme that humans may find redemption through sexuality. According to one such view recorded in Plato's dialogue, the Symposium, human beings were originally androgynous, male-female composites. Zeus divided the androgyne as a punishment for hubris, and ever since we have searched for our other halves. And this fact is summoned to explain how we became estranged from one another. The remedy is bound up with the prospect of being able to locate our soulmates and reunite our beings. On this wavelength, which was imported into Gnosticism, the existential malady of humanity results from the differentiation of the sexes. Our originally androgynous unity has been compromised. Christ's purpose was to reunite Adam and Eve. Arguably, some of this is both echoed and expanded and modified in today's LGBTQ movement, where binary sexes are being supplanted by notions of gender identification and sexual fluidity. But in the Gospel of Philip, these musings are situated within a grand cosmological framework called the pleroma, or fullness. Thus, given cosmic proportions, a human matchmaking process is encouraged, affected, or at least represented by a provocative ritual called the bride chamber. Novelist Dan Brown made use of this quasi-sacramental bridal chamber in his 2003 adventure mystery, The Da Vinci Code. Not only does Brown incorporate sex magical themes, but he also has the character Sir Lee Teabing quote the Gospel of Philip to imply that Mary Magdalene was Jesus' consort. The extant text has several gaps, called lacunae, that make it incomprehensible as it is. Those, like Dan Brown, who wish to transform it into blockbuster script fodder, must take some liberties with their translations. In the Da Vinci Code storyline, a shadowy and likely invented military religious order known as the Priory of Sion partly preserve and transmit their flavor of Gnosticism via a sex-suffused ritual that Dan Brown termed a hieros gamos, or sacred marriage. Controversy also surrounds the historical bride chamber ritual described in the Gospel of Philip. It's hotly debated whether the ceremony was a bit of kinky pantomiming for an otherwise conservative-minded coterie of ascetics, or whether it was a bona fide example of magia sexualis and spermo-Gnosticism. For more on these tangled skeins, see Top 10 Sex Magic Cults. Regardless, and like the Gospel of Truth, the Gospel of Philip is usually associated with a version of Gnosticism called Valentinianism. For a bit more about its founder, Valentinus, see 10 Arcane Words and Be My Valentine. And once again, for a bird's eye view of the general belief system, see Gnosticism Explained in 5 minutes. Number 2. The Gospel of Judas. Lost for 1,600 years, but widely available as of 2006, the Gospel of Judas was purchased and later published by the National Geographic Society. This media event was timed for 1 week before Easter Sunday. This is typical. Consider the sensational 2007 production, The Lost Tomb of Jesus, executively produced by James Cameron no less, which likewise preceded the Christian High Holy Day, and which even Wikipedia now admits was an exercise in pseudo-archaeology. In the case of the Gospel of Judas, a bit of intrigue is associated with the acquisition of the manuscript. Reportedly, National Geographic paid over $1 million to a sketchy antiquities trafficker named Frieda Chakas Nussberger. In 2002, Nussberger was convicted of hawking looted art. Of course, this checkered history isn't to say that the document itself is a fabrication. Still, the very existence of a Gospel of Judas is a puzzle. Because of the canonical Gospels, the name Judas became a byword for treachery. It's every bit as charged as Brutus or Benedict Arnold. Admittedly, the name Judas has a synchromystic buzz. It seems a favorite of various singer-songwriters, such as the Beatles' Paul McCartney. Occasionally, the 1968 song Hey Jude is interpreted as possibly invoking the alternate specters of St. Jude and Judas Iscariot. And then there's Robert Allen Zimmerman, better known as Bob Dylan. Zimmerman incorporated the trope into his 1966 The Ballad of Frankie Lee and Judas Priest. Dylan's song allegedly inspired the British heavy metal band called Judas Priest. In 1990, Judas Priest was sued in the United States for supposedly encoding subliminal messages in its songs, one of which, the legal action alleged, prompted 2 young men in Nevada to attempt to self-harm. 18-year-old Raymond Belknap ended up dead, and his friend James Vance was left grotesquely disfigured. The latter died of a drug overdose a short time later. Not to be outdone, the sensational popular performer Stefani Germanotta, under her stage name Lady Gaga, released the song Judas in 2011 on her album Born This Way. Of course, Gaga's piece was downstream of the National Geographic reconstruction and translation of the Gospel of Judas. In the Nat Geo version, which was given heavy media attention, Judas is radically reimagined. Formerly associated with Satan, the arch-betrayer is rehabilitated according to the tenets of a branch of Gnosticism known as Sethianism. We mentioned Sethianism earlier, of course, as well as briefly in our video 10 Sex Magic Cults. On a cosmic scale, Sethianism represents the universe as unfolding out of a complex series of emanations, which concept we explained in 10 Arcane Words. Similarly to Neoplatonism, at the pinnacle of this hierarchy is the true but ineffable God. On one interpretation, a supposedly perfect man, depicted as the legendary Seth, emerged from this chain of being. In this alternative and debated gospel account, the apostle Judas correctly perceived Seth's empowerment of the human Jesus. In line with Gnosticism's view that matter and bodies are evil, Judas assisted Jesus with his plan, namely dramatically sloughing off his mortal coil via Roman execution. The point? To reveal the Gnostic prescription for salvation, freeing the soul from its fleshly prison. In this way, Judas's act of turning Jesus over to be crucified is reinterpreted. No longer is his act a betrayal of Jesus' messianic purposes. No more is Judas a demonically inspired antichrist. On the contrary, unlike the other disciples who never quite grasped the truth, Judas recognized the necessity of the crucifixion as an essential precondition for Jesus' escape from his body. Thus, on the Gnostic blueprint, Jesus is our example, and Judas showed the way. Number 1. The Gospel of Thomas. The quirky, albeit contentious, rereading of Judas brings us to our final installment, another of the documents discovered at Nag Hammadi. This gospel transforms doubting Thomas into the dutiful scribe of Jesus' secret teachings, possibly dating to the early 2nd century, and unlike the 4 canonical gospels in the New Testament, and even unlike many of the other texts we've just surveyed, the Gospel of Thomas isn't structured as a narrative. Rather, except for its prologue, its body is composed of 114 discrete sayings attributed to Jesus. Its title stems from the claim that these sayings were faithfully recorded by one Didymus Judas Thomas. The name Didymus means twin in Greek. Interestingly, Thomas derives from Aramaic, where it also means twin. This unmistakable double emphasis arose within a group of Syriac Christians. Some of these believers may have held that Thomas was the twin in some way of Jesus himself. Thomas's importance is of course stressed in the gospel that bears his name. If Catholics and Protestants are arguably followers of Peter and Paul respectively, and if other Christians reserved special status for other apostles, or other alleged apostles, such as James, Mary Magdalene, Matthew, and Philip, it shouldn't surprise us to find that Thomas has his cheerleaders too. Incidentally, a group of these so-called Thomasines exists in India, where believers are known as St. Thomas Christians. 17th century Roman Catholic Carmelite friar Ignatius of Jesus once compared the previously mentioned Mandaeans with the Christians of St. Thomas on the coast of Malabar, who claimed to be descended from some of the original converts of the Apostle St. Thomas. Many academic observers have noted the Gospel of Thomas's preoccupation with notions of hidden understanding and the sort of world-rejecting privileged knowledge that partially characterized Gnosticism. By extension, the Gospel of Thomas represents Jesus as counseling people to be passers-by and solitary. Thus, it represents Jesus as promoting a species of spiritual detachment that has analogs in Greek Stoicism and Eastern philosophies such as Buddhism. All this can be seen as underscoring the Gnostic diagnosis of the human condition. We, or at any rate some of us, are spiritual beings trapped in the world of matter. The name of the game, as it was developed more clearly in other texts, is to transcend the body and rediscover our true selves. This escape plan begins with an awareness of who we really are, a self-awareness that is echoed in the Delphic maxim, know thyself. Gnosis, after all, is a reference to this hidden knowledge. We've gone into these matters, of course, at greater length in 10 Arcane Words, and Gnosticism Explained in 5 minutes. For the more libidinous practices of so-called spermo-Gnostics, see again 10 Sex Magic Cults. Although some dispute the Gospel's connection to Gnosticism, many of the Thomasines appear to have meditated upon the ineffable and veiled nature of Jesus. Without a doubt, in the Gospel of Thomas, our titular spokesman assumes the mantle of divine mouthpiece, transmitting Jesus' teachings with authority and fidelity. Saying number 13 depicts Thomas as the recipient of what appears to be personal revelation, in an obvious parallel to Simon Peter's declaration of Jesus' messiahship as recorded in the Gospel of Matthew, chapter 16, verse 16. Thomas says, "Master, my mouth is wholly incapable of saying whom you are like." We're then told that Jesus immediately took Thomas aside for special instruction. Jesus told Thomas 3 things, or in another translation, uttered 3 words to him. When questioned, Thomas refused to disclose the secret teaching, predicting, "If I told you one of the things which he told me, you would pick up stones and throw them at me, and a fire would come out of the stones and burn you up." Some interpreters want to connect this private revelation to the Tetragrammaton, the mystical 4 letters that designate the name of the Hebrew God, Yahweh or Jehovah, and which assume colossal proportions in Kabbalah, or Kabbalah. We will have to excavate that claim another time, but if you are interested in more now, we touched on Jewish esotericism in 10 Arcane Words, and, again, 10 Sex Magic Cults. Yes, upon its rediscovery, the Gospel of Judas created quite a stir, but the Gospel of Thomas has been talked about for longer. Since its discovery in 1945, it has been especially intriguing to so-called critical Bible scholars. According to this broad category of analysts, the Bible was a product of a long period of textual evolution. This involved initial source materials being expanded upon and revised until what emerged was the Old and New Testaments we recognize today. In the opinion of textual critics, among the foundational documents was a hypothetical manuscript academics have taken to calling Q. Now is not the place to get into all the recent synchromistic appearances of this curious letter. We may examine its importance for predictive programming and social engineering in another episode. At present, Q is an abbreviation of the German word Quelle, which means source. There are as many permutations of source theories as there are theorists, but given the Gospel of Thomas's narrativeless structure and antiquity, a few observers have registered their opinions that the Gospel of Thomas is itself a version of the Q text. Others are a bit more cautious. The majority view seems to be that the bare existence of the Gospel of Thomas provides reason to think that other early collections of Jesus' sayings may have existed. These could have served as the fodder or inspiration for the more cohesive stories found in the Gospels of Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. Conservative evaluators generally chalk all these possibilities up to imagination and presuppositions of naturalism, rather than to conclusions strictly entailed by the available evidence. And indeed, Hollywood storytellers have wasted no time weaving the Gospel of Thomas into their fictions. A prominent example here is the 1999 movie Stigmata, starring Patricia Arquette, Gabriel Byrne, and Jonathan Pryce. The horror film is premised on the phenomenon whereby individuals apparently experience the wounds of Christ on their bodies. In any event, before the final credits roll, the producers appeal to the manuscript trove recovered in Nag Hammadi, Egypt. They then name the Gospel of St. Thomas explicitly and proceed to hint that the Vatican is scheming to cover up what they claim may just be the closest record we have of the words of the historical Jesus, which you'll admit makes for provocative cinema. The acting and script, well, those are other matters and beyond our present scope. Of course, there are numerous other manuscripts that we could have included. Some perhaps have historical value, others do not. As a parting illustration, consider the document dubbed the Gospel of Jesus' Wife. The text was publicized with great hoopla in 2012. Initially, it was represented as a bombshell revelation, especially given that it begins with the words, "Jesus said to them, 'My wife.'" The manuscript, which actually was just a fragment, was given a veneer of respectability in virtue of being presented by Harvard Divinity School professor Karen King. But the wife gospel is now regarded as having been a modern forgery, and predictably, King has taken a hit to her scholarly reputation. Though in her defense, the cheat was supposedly difficult to detect. The faker, who some suspect was an internet pornographer, apparently used a genuinely old scrap of papyrus. It was just the text he wrote on it that was the counterfeit. What should we cover next? If you have an opinion, feel free to communicate it to us in the comments below. But if you found something of interest in this video, please like it, and if you're not already subscribed, consider doing so. Be sure to turn on notifications to be alerted to new content as it becomes available. And if you think someone else might find value in the content, please share the link. Thank you for watching.